Some stories are so horrifying that they blur the line between sin, suffering, and madness. In 1858 New Orleans, during the sacred days of Holy Week, the city was gripped by terror when whispers spread about a slave woman accused of burying children alive as part of a ritual no one could fully understand. Was it vengeance, insanity, or something darker born from years of torment and superstition? The truth is tangled in church records, old police logs, and testimonies that historians still debate today. Before we uncover this deeply disturbing chapter, tell me, where are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon. Because every story here comes from painstaking research through real historical archives and true accounts that time tried to erase. She was known only by her first name, Celeste. No surname, no history anyone dared to record, only whispers that she had once come from the northern edge of Louisiana before being sold south into the sweltering heart of New Orleans. By 1858, she was owned by a French Creole family whose plantation sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by marshland and swamps that seemed to swallow sound. The house itself was large but decaying, its beauty rotting from the inside, much like the secrets it held. Celeste worked as a house servant, cleaning, cooking, and caring for the plantation's children. To outsiders, she appeared quiet and obedient. Yet those who lived under the same roof swore there was something strange about her, a certain heaviness in her gaze, an intensity that made even the overseer uneasy. The years leading up to 1858 had been hard ones in Louisiana. Disease and death haunted the city like shadows. Yellow fever had struck repeatedly, and superstition filled the void where medicine failed. Among both enslaved and free people, spiritual practices blended, African beliefs mixed with Catholic rituals, creating a faith that was both deeply holy and deeply haunted. Celeste lived at the intersection of those worlds. She attended Mass when allowed, clutching her rosary with trembling hands, but at night she whispered prayers in another tongue, ancient, rhythmic, and filled with emotion. The other servants spoke of her dreams, of how she sometimes woke screaming in the dark, muttering names no one recognized. Her life on the plantation was one of isolation. The mistress of the house, a widow named Madame de la Roche, often relied on Celeste to watch her two young daughters. She trusted her more than any other servant, believing her to be devoted and harmless. But others in the household were less certain. They noticed the way animals grew restless when Celeste entered a room, how she sometimes stood alone by the garden graves of children who had died years before, tracing the crosses in the dirt as if speaking to them. Some said she talked to spirits. Others said she simply carried too much grief for one soul to bear. Celeste's origins were a mystery even to herself. She had vague memories of her mother, a woman who practiced healing with herbs and smoke, but her face had long faded from memory. Sold and resold from one owner to another, Celeste's sense of self had been stripped away until only fragments remained. Her belief in both God and older, deeper spirits was all that survived. To her, the two worlds were not separate but connected, each answering to the other. It was this strange duality that would later become the center of the horror that engulfed her. The city of New Orleans, a place already steeped in mysticism, was the perfect stage for a tragedy like hers. It was a place where religion was everywhere, yet sin never slept. Churches stood beside brothels. Sermons were followed by seances. The enslaved population, caught between cultures, had learned to hide their spiritual traditions behind the guise of Catholic prayer. Celeste did the same. She prayed before saints, but whispered to shadows. When Holy Week approached in 1858, she became more withdrawn, fasting and murmuring about redemption and sacrifice. The other servants began to avoid her, whispering that she was preparing for something unholy. Her presence in the household was tolerated but not understood. To Madame de la Roche, she was simply a faithful servant, devoted to the church. But beneath that quiet exterior, Celeste carried the weight of years of suffering, superstition, and spiritual confusion. She was a woman torn between salvation and something far darker, shaped by a world that had given her no mercy. In her mind, she believed she was chosen for a purpose, a cleansing, perhaps, or a calling she could not resist. And as the bells of Holy Week began to toll across New Orleans, the line between her faith and her madness began to blur, setting the stage for the horrors that were about to unfold. As Holy Week approached in the spring of 1858, Celeste's behavior began to shift from the quiet routine of servitude to something deeply unsettling. Those who lived and worked alongside her said she seemed to move as if guided by invisible hands, her eyes distant, her mind lost somewhere between prayer and delirium. She spent long hours in the small chapel behind the plantation, kneeling before the Virgin Mary, with her rosary clutched so tightly that her fingers bled. She whispered in both French and another language no one recognized, her voice rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded more like chanting than prayer. The Catholic faith had always been important on the De la Roche estate. The family considered themselves devout, and Holy Week, the days leading up to Easter, was treated with sacred reverence. But Celeste's devotion was different. It was desperate, consuming. She fasted for days, refusing food or water, claiming that her body had to be purified before the blood of Christ returned to the earth. Some of the other servants tried to intervene, offering her bread or soup, but she pushed them away, muttering that the flesh must be denied before the spirit could be cleansed. She grew pale and thin, yet her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The first signs of true unease came when she began talking about voices. Late at night, the other slaves heard her whispering through the thin wooden walls, holding conversations with someone or something that no one else could see. She claimed the spirits of children visited her, crying for deliverance, begging her to help them find peace. At first, the others dismissed it as exhaustion or religious frenzy. The lines between faith and madness were often blurred among those who suffered so deeply. But as her visions became darker, the fear in the quarters grew. Celeste said that God had chosen her to cleanse sin from the innocent, to protect their souls before the coming of judgment. By the Wednesday of Holy Week, her obsession had intensified. She began collecting small crucifixes, holy water, and scraps of white cloth from the chapel, hiding them beneath her cot. When questioned, she claimed the Virgin herself had instructed her to prepare for the purification. Even the overseer, normally cruel and skeptical, felt uneasy watching her. He said that when Celeste prayed, her voice carried through the halls like a chant from another world, low and trembling, sending chills down his spine. Madame de la Roche noticed the change too. She once caught Celeste standing at the foot of the children's beds, humming softly in the candlelight. When asked what she was doing, Celeste said she was protecting their souls from the serpent. The widow, though disturbed, did not punish her. Instead, she instructed the priest to bless the house before Easter, sensing that something unnatural had begun to take root under her roof. But no blessing could undo what was already set in motion. Celeste had begun blending her Catholic devotion with the remnants of African spiritual belief that had survived generations of bondage. She spoke of sacrifice, of returning the pure to the earth so that sin would not claim them. Her words frightened even the most faithful among the servants. Some avoided her entirely, claiming her prayers made the air cold and heavy. Others whispered that she was possessed. In the final days before Good Friday, Celeste stopped sleeping altogether. She walked the grounds at night, barefoot, tracing circles in the dirt and murmuring prayers to saints and spirits alike. The rosary never left her hands. She wept often, speaking of fire and redemption, of the blood that must be spilled for the world to be cleansed. She was convinced that a great darkness was coming, and that only she could save the innocent before it arrived. By the time the church bells began to ring for Holy Thursday, Celeste was no longer the quiet, obedient servant she had once been. Something within her had broken or awakened. Her faith, once a fragile thread holding her to sanity, had twisted into obsession. Those around her would later say that her eyes no longer looked human. Whatever she believed she was serving, God, spirit, or madness, it had consumed her completely. And as the sacred days of Holy Week unfolded, that devotion would drive her toward a horror that New Orleans would never forget. The first disappearance was almost invisible, swallowed by the chaos of the plantation's daily routine. It was Movet, the youngest child of a field hand, barely 4 years old, with a laugh that used to echo through the yard. One morning she was gone. Her mother searched frantically, calling her name until her voice broke, but no one had seen the child since the night before. The overseer dismissed it coldly, saying the girl had likely wandered off into the swamps. It wasn't unusual for the bayou to take lives. Its shadows were deep and merciless. Yet something about the mother's trembling words lingered. She swore she'd heard soft singing near the chapel that night. A lullaby she recognized as Celeste's. The plantation went quiet for days after that. The other mothers clutched their children tighter. Celeste, meanwhile, continued her prayers. Her hands blistered from the rosary beads, her lips cracked from fasting. When asked about the missing child, she said only, "The angels took her where pain cannot follow." Her voice was calm, almost tender, as though she truly believed what she said. Those words should have been a warning, but no one dared question her further. To the others, she had become both terrifying and sacred, untouchable. A week later, during the height of Holy Week, another child vanished. This time, it was one of Madame Delaroche's own, a 7-year-old boy named Baptiste. His mother, the widow herself, was known for her fierce control. But when she realized the boy's bed was empty at dawn, her screams tore through the entire estate. A frantic search began. Servants combed the grounds, scoured the riverbank, and even turned over barrels in the storage house. But there was no trace of him. Only one thing seemed out of place: small footprints in the damp soil near the chapel garden, alongside marks where the earth had been disturbed. Celeste stood nearby as the search unfolded, her white dress smeared with mud. When the widow demanded to know where the boy was, Celeste bowed her head and whispered, "He sleeps beneath holy ground. The Lord has him now." Those who heard her said her tone was neither apologetic nor frightened. It was reverent, as though she'd done something sacred. Madame Delaroche slapped her across the face, but Celeste didn't flinch. She simply looked up, eyes shining with tears, and said, "He's safe from the coming fire." That was the moment the fear on the plantation became something more, a silent dread that seeped into every corner of the house. Children were no longer allowed outside alone. Mothers prayed in whispers, clutching makeshift charms for protection. Even the priest, when summoned, hesitated to enter the grounds after sunset. He performed another blessing over the chapel, sprinkling holy water as he muttered Latin under his breath. But he refused to speak Celeste's name afterward. Over the next several nights, strange things began to happen. Servants reported seeing faint candlelight near the garden long after midnight. The sound of shovels scraping earth echoed faintly through the still air, followed by soft singing, the same lullaby Mauvette's mother had heard. Some swore they saw Celeste moving through the mist, carrying bundles wrapped in white cloth, but when they approached, she was gone. Then came the rain. A heavy storm rolled over the estate on Good Friday, flooding the lower fields and washing away much of the disturbed soil. When the water receded 2 days later, a horrific sight emerged. Shallow mounds near the chapel had collapsed, revealing fragments of cloth and small, lifeless hands reaching through the mud. The truth could no longer be hidden. The plantation erupted in chaos. The overseer dragged Celeste from her quarters, her dress soaked and torn, her hair matted with dirt. Yet she didn't resist. She looked up at the furious crowd and said softly, "They are free now. Their souls will rise before the rest of us." Some claimed she smiled as she spoke, as if she had fulfilled a divine mission. Others said she seemed lost, caught between two worlds, one of faith, one of madness. The widow collapsed when she saw the evidence, and the priest refused to conduct a proper burial, calling the ground desecrated by unholy intent. Still, whispers spread among the slaves that Celeste had been guided by spirits, that she had heard the cries of children trapped between life and the afterlife, and had only meant to save them. But whether she was a savior or a murderer no longer mattered. The horror she left behind had already carved itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. The disappearances had become more than tragedy. They were a revelation of how far faith can twist under suffering. And as the truth of those buried children came to light, New Orleans would soon learn that evil doesn't always wear the face of hate. Sometimes it hides behind the mask of devotion. The morning of Holy Saturday dawned heavy with silence, as if even the air itself hesitated to move. After the terrible storm that had torn through the night before, the ground was slick and soft, the scent of wet earth mixing with the faint sweetness of magnolia. Workers had gathered uneasily near the chapel garden, where the rain had exposed something they wished they'd never seen. What began as whispers became shouts. Someone had found the small, pale hand of a child pushing through the soil. Within minutes, the entire plantation was awake, and terror spread like wildfire. The overseer, a hard man known for his cruelty, ordered the area to be dug up immediately. The first spadeful of dirt turned over what looked like a burial cloth, tied at the corners like a shroud. The men hesitated, exchanging glances. The widow, Madame Delaroche, arrived moments later, her gown soaked at the hem, her face white with dread. When the cloth was fully unearthed, a cry broke from her throat, a sound that silenced everyone. Inside the shallow grave was the small, lifeless body of her son, Baptiste. His hands were clasped together as if in prayer, and his lips were coated in mud. Around him lay bits of crucifixes, rosary beads, and wilted flowers from the chapel altar. As more ground was unearthed, more bundles appeared, tiny, silent forms wrapped in cloth. The air filled with screams and sobs. Mothers collapsed where they stood. Even the overseer trembled as he uncovered one after another, each child buried with a strange sense of care, as though whoever had done this believed it was an act of mercy. Near the final mound, they found a small wooden cross driven into the ground with shaky hands, marked only with one word scratched in charcoal: redeemed. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into accusations. The servants who had seen Celeste wandering the garden at night pointed trembling fingers toward her quarters. When the men stormed in, they found her kneeling by her cot, still praying. Her dress was caked with mud, her nails blackened from digging, and her hands clasped tightly around a rosary. She didn't scream or run when they dragged her out. She simply lifted her head toward the grey sky and whispered, "I did what he asked of me." Madame Delaroche slapped her, shouting for answers, demanding to know why. Celeste turned to her with a calm so unnatural that even the overseer hesitated to touch her. "The children were pure," she said softly. "They heard the angels calling. They were chosen to go before us, to stand clean before the fire." When pressed further, she began to weep, not from guilt, but from something closer to divine anguish. "Their souls were trapped here," she murmured. "The earth had to take them so heaven could open." Her words sent shivers through everyone present. The priest was summoned at once, and when he arrived, the sight before him nearly made him faint. The desecrated graves, the crying mothers, and Celeste, calm, almost radiant in her delirium, were too much to comprehend. He declared her possessed, claiming she had fallen under demonic influence, masked as faith. Holy water was thrown upon her, but instead of recoiling, Celeste laughed. "You cannot wash away what was done in his name," she said. The crowd that gathered outside the chapel quickly turned from grief to rage. Some of the field hands wanted her hanged immediately. Others pleaded for her to be exorcised. But Madame Delaroche, her face frozen with pain, ordered her locked in the smokehouse until the authorities could arrive from New Orleans. The sounds that came from that building through the night haunted everyone who heard them. Singing, prayers, and at times a child's laughter echoing faintly through the cracks in the walls. When the sheriff finally came the next morning, he found Celeste sitting in the corner, her hands folded neatly, her eyes unfocused. She did not resist as they bound her wrists. As they led her past the graves, she paused, gazing down at the disturbed soil. "They are free now," she whispered. "Free from hunger, free from chains." The sheriff looked away, shaken. He'd seen murder before, but never anything like this. A woman who spoke of killing children as though she'd performed a holy act. As they rode toward the city, she hummed softly under her breath, a hymn known only to her. Back on the plantation, the horror left a scar no one could erase. The chapel was boarded up, the garden abandoned. The priest performed rites of cleansing, but some said the ground never felt right again. Cattle refused to graze there. Children claimed to see small footprints appear in the mud after rainstorms, though no one dared look too closely. The discovery of those graves didn't just reveal a crime. It revealed a collapse of faith, a sickness born from centuries of pain and oppression. Celeste believed she was saving those children from a cruel world, but what she had done was something no God could ever forgive. And in the hearts of those who survived, untruth lingered. Madness and devotion, when tangled too tightly, can lead even the most faithful into hell itself. In the days that followed her arrest, The plantation was flooded with officials, priests, and curious onlookers. Newspapers from New Orleans called it the Holy Week murders, while the church whispered of a woman consumed by dark forces. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that no one truly understood what had happened, or what Celeste had become. When she was questioned, she spoke in riddles, alternating between tearful prayers and cryptic warnings. One moment she claimed innocence, saying she had only laid the children to rest as commanded. The next, she spoke as though she were possessed, her voice shifting, her words strange and broken. Witnesses were divided. Some swore they had seen her in the garden that night, shoveling earth with her bare hands, her face streaked with tears. Others insisted she had been in the chapel, praying fervently before the statue of the Virgin, her voice trembling as she begged for forgiveness. Even among the enslaved there was no agreement. A few said she was evil, that she had become a servant of the devil who lured children with promises of salvation. But others, those who had seen her gentle kindness before the madness, believed something else entirely. They whispered that she had been chosen, that she was guided by a spirit older than any Christian god. One of the priests brought in from the cathedral in New Orleans claimed to have performed an exorcism on her the night before her transfer. He described how she writhed and screamed when he pressed the crucifix against her skin. Her body convulsed violently, her eyes rolled back, and she began speaking in a tongue no one recognized. Some said it was the language of the old world, the African prayers that had survived generations of bondage. But when she suddenly began reciting Latin verses from the book of Revelation, word for word, the priest dropped his Bible in fear. He swore that she could not have known those passages. When he demanded to know who she served, she looked up at him and said, "I serve the one who hears the children cry." Then she smiled, a faint, sorrowful smile that chilled everyone in the room. The priest fled, muttering that she was beyond salvation. From that moment on, the story split in two. To some, she was a murderer beyond redemption. To others, she was a vessel of divine punishment, sent to cleanse the innocent from a corrupt world. At her hearing in New Orleans, the courtroom was packed. The air smelled of sweat and candle wax, and the whispers never stopped. Celeste stood before the judge barefoot, her wrists bound, her white dress replaced by a grey prison gown. When asked to confirm her name, she said softly, "I am what he made me." The prosecutor read aloud the accusations: infanticide, desecration of holy ground, and blasphemy. But she didn't flinch. Her gaze was fixed somewhere above the crowd, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. During the trial, the defense tried to plead insanity. Doctors testified that she suffered from religious mania, a condition known to make women lose their sense of right and wrong under the weight of extreme faith. But others, especially the priests, insisted she was not mad, only evil. When asked to explain her actions, she said in a calm, almost soothing tone, "Their souls were too pure for this place. I gave them back to God before man could take them." The courtroom erupted in gasps. The judge pounded his gavel, but even he looked shaken. Some witnesses claimed strange things began happening during her testimony. Candles flickered, though there was no wind. The crucifix hanging above the bench rattled against the wall. A young clerk fainted, saying he saw shadows moving around her feet like smoke. The newspapers called it hysteria, but those who were there swore it was real. Despite the chaos, the verdict came quickly. She was found guilty. though many doubted that execution could ever truly punish her. Before sentencing, she was allowed to speak. Celeste stood, her voice trembling, and said, "I will not fear death. The children will meet me when the trumpet sounds. You cannot bury what is already blessed." Some said her words sent a chill through the entire courtroom. As she was led away, one woman in the crowd shouted that Celeste's eyes had turned completely black. Another swore that she saw a faint glow around her body, as if lit from within. Whether it was the trick of candlelight or something unholy, no one could say. But even after she was taken to her cell, the arguments continued. Was she a monster driven by madness, or a vessel through which something divine and terrible had spoken? That uncertainty haunted New Orleans long after the trial ended. The line between possession and insanity had blurred so completely that no one dared to speak her name in church again. For those who had seen her, there was no comfort, only the lingering dread that perhaps Celeste hadn't been entirely wrong. Perhaps she had truly believed she was saving the children, and in her faith-twisted mind that made her the only one still obeying God. The Catholic Church in New Orleans had long held authority not just over faith, but over the rhythm of the city's soul. Bells rang to mark the passing of time. Priests walked every corner, and confession was as common as breath. But when word spread that a slave woman had murdered children in the name of God during the holiest week of the year, that authority began to crack. The church faced an impossible question. How could such horror exist in the shadow of its cross? How could faith itself be twisted into an instrument of death? Within days of Celeste's arrest, the Archdiocese of New Orleans called for an emergency council. Letters flew between priests, bishops, and abbots, each trying to determine whether this was a case of demonic possession or of human blasphemy. The story was spreading faster than any sermon. Parishioners whispered of miracles turned to curses, of saints who had abandoned the city. Attendance at Mass dropped sharply, while the confessionals overflowed with fear. Some mothers refused to let their children attend catechism, afraid that evil had seeped into the very walls of the church. The Archdiocese assigned Father Etienne Morel, a seasoned exorcist from France, to examine Celeste. He was a cold, disciplined man who believed the devil could take any form, especially that of the desperate and the faithful. When he first saw her, chained and kneeling in her cell, she smiled faintly and whispered, "You came too late." The words shook him. He sprinkled holy water, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she began to pray in Latin, matching his voice word for word, but reversing the phrases, turning blessings into something that sounded like curses. The church's official report would later describe what happened in that room as an encounter with something unholy. Father Morel claimed the temperature dropped, the candles guttered out, and for a brief moment he smelled the distinct scent of blood and lilies, symbols of both death and purity. Celeste's eyes, he said, were hollow as graves, yet filled with faith. He concluded she was not possessed in the ordinary sense. Rather, she had invited something in. He wrote, "She believes herself God's servant, but she speaks with the voice of something that despises him." That conclusion left the church paralyzed. To declare her possessed would imply that their rituals had failed, that the devil had entered a woman under their watch. To declare her mad would suggest their faith could drive a soul to madness. So they chose silence. The church publicly condemned her as a heretic, forbidding any priest from mentioning her name during Mass. The chapel where the children had been found was ordered to be demolished, its ground salted and sealed. But even that act of cleansing did not still the fear that had taken root in New Orleans. As word spread among the city's enslaved population, whispers of Celeste's act took on a different meaning. To them, she was no heretic. She was a symbol of defiance, a woman who had used the Master's faith to strike at the Master's world. Some said she had freed those children from the endless chain of suffering that awaited them. Songs began to appear in the quarters, low, mournful hymns that mixed Christian prayer with African rhythm. They called her Mama beneath the cross, the one who fed the earth with innocence so it could cry no more. That frightened the church more than anything else. To the priests, her memory becoming legend was proof that darkness spreads fastest through the hearts of the oppressed. The archbishop ordered all traces of her story erased from parish records. Her name was blotted out, the trial documents sealed, and the surviving servants warned that speaking of her would bring damnation. But silence only fed the myth. Rumors soon surfaced that miracles and horrors began happening around the site of the old chapel. Some claimed to see faint lights floating near the garden at night. Others said they heard the laughter of children carried by the wind. A priest who tried to perform a final exorcism there reportedly fell ill within days and never recovered. The faithful began to avoid that part of town altogether, calling it the ground of the lost. By Easter Sunday, just weeks after the crimes, the church held its grand mass at St. Louis Cathedral under a veil of unease. The candles burned low, and the archbishop's sermon spoke not of resurrection, but of vigilance. The devil, he said, does not always appear in shadow. Sometimes he hides in prayer. His voice trembled as he spoke, though few noticed. In private, however, some priests whispered that Celeste's faith had revealed an uncomfortable truth, that slavery itself had corrupted the sanctity of religion, twisting holy words into chains. To them, Celeste was not just a murderer, but a mirror showing what the church refused to see, a woman driven mad by a religion that offered salvation only to her captors. The church buried her case in silence, but the damage was done. Faith had cracked, fear had taken root, and in the shadows of New Orleans, people began to believe that even God's house could harbor ghosts. Celeste's story became a haunting reminder that holiness and horror sometimes share the same altar, and that the line between the sacred and the damned can vanish when pain becomes prayer. Celeste's final confession came not in the courtroom but in the dim, candlelit cell where she awaited execution. The jailer, a man named Joseph Duray, later claimed she barely ate or slept during her final days. Instead, she spent her nights whispering to unseen visitors, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing softly as if comforting a child. He often heard her singing old Creole hymns in a voice so gentle it made the hairs on his arms rise. When he asked who she was talking to, she would smile and say, "They're here listening. The little ones are never far." 2 days before her hanging, the prison chaplain visited to offer confession. What he recorded afterward would haunt him for the rest of his life. Celeste did not beg forgiveness. She did not weep for the children or deny her actions. Instead, she spoke with an eerie calm, as if she were explaining a sacred ritual misunderstood by the world. "They were crying," she said. "I could hear them in my sleep. Their souls were trapped in pain, in a world built on sin and hunger. I asked God how to free them, and he answered in the fire of the Holy Week candles. He said the earth must take them back so they can rise untainted. The priest tried to interrupt her, insisting that God would never command such a thing, but Celeste only smiled faintly. "You have not seen what I have seen," she replied. "You kneel in comfort, Father. I knelt in blood." Her voice grew heavy then, her eyes distant. "The children begged me not to stop. They said the angels were waiting. They weren't afraid." The chaplain later wrote that her expression, though calm, carried something beyond madness, an unshakable belief that she had done right. But what unsettled him most was what came next. As she spoke, the air in the cell grew cold, and the flickering candle between them dimmed. Celeste's tone changed, her voice lowering, almost unrecognizable. "You will see them," she said softly, "when the bells toll and the ground shakes. You will hear their laughter." The priest fled moments later, pale and trembling, convinced he had spoken not to a woman, but to something that wore her voice. When the morning of her execution arrived, a heavy fog hung over New Orleans. The gallows were built in the courtyard of St. Roch prison, and by dawn, a crowd had gathered despite the church's warnings. Among them were slaves, freedmen, and wealthy townsfolk, each drawn by curiosity, fear, or perhaps guilt. Celeste was led out barefoot, wearing a plain white dress. Her hair, once braided neatly, fell loose over her shoulders. Some swore that as she walked, the fog parted around her like mist around a flame. The priest who had taken her confession stood beside her, trembling. She turned to him and whispered something no one else heard, but his face went ashen. He later refused to repeat her words. When asked if she had any last statement, Celeste looked toward the crowd and said, "You cannot hang faith. The body will fall, but the spirit has already risen." Then, as the rope was placed around her neck, she began to sing, the same lullaby the mothers on the plantation had once heard drifting through the night. The melody was soft and haunting, carrying through the fog like a prayer. When the platform dropped, witnesses claimed the air turned bitter cold, and the church bells in the nearby quarter began ringing without anyone touching the ropes. The crowd scattered in terror, convinced the devil had taken her soul. But others, especially the enslaved who watched from the edges, whispered through their tears that she had been taken by the spirits she'd freed. Some even claimed they saw small, faint lights rise into the air, like fireflies drifting upward into the clouds. The body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the city, but peace never settled over that ground. The priest who had confessed her fell gravely ill soon after and died within a week. His attendants said he kept murmuring about children laughing in the dark. The jailer, Joseph Duray, also left his position, saying he couldn't bear to walk past the cell again. Every night, he claimed, he still heard that lullaby echoing faintly through the stone walls. Years later, when the prison was torn down, workers digging near the site uncovered strange symbols carved into the foundation stones, crosses surrounded by small circles, as though representing children. No one could explain them. Some believed Celeste had carved them herself during her final nights, marking the place as sacred. Others thought they appeared afterward, etched by forces unseen. Her story spread across Louisiana, growing more ghostly with every retelling. Some said her spirit appeared during Holy Week, walking barefoot through graveyards, humming that same tune. Others claimed she haunted the riverbanks, her shadow drifting over the water, followed by the faint laughter of unseen children. The church called these stories blasphemy, but the people, especially those who had once lived in chains, called her something else, the mother who freed souls. Even now, More than a century later, some say the bells of St. Roch still ring at strange hours during Holy Week. And if you listen closely, beneath the sound of the metal, you can hear the faint whisper of her voice, singing for the children she believed she saved, and for a world that could never understand her faith, her madness, or her mercy. Even decades after Celeste's death, the shadows of her actions lingered over New Orleans, threading themselves into the city's folklore, whispered from one generation to the next. Plantation workers and freedmen alike carried her story with them, turning it into cautionary tales told in the quarters long after slavery was abolished. Her name, though officially expunged from church and court records, became synonymous with the terrifying edge where faith, suffering, and madness intersect. Some spoke of her as a vengeful spirit, others as a martyr, misunderstood by the living. But all agreed that her presence was never truly gone. Families who lived near the old Delaroche estate reported strange occurrences for years. Children would wake screaming in the middle of the night, claiming to see a woman in white wandering the marshes, carrying something small and wrapped in cloth. Animals avoided certain areas near the former chapel, and crops near the garden where the burials had taken place would fail mysteriously, as if the earth itself remembered the horrors it had been forced to swallow. Even in modern times, locals spoke of faint singing drifting on the wind during Holy Week, a lullaby no one could trace, a reminder of the souls Celeste had claimed, or, in her mind, saved. The legend also shaped the way the city viewed the intersection of slavery, religion, and superstition. Scholars and storytellers alike noted that Celeste's story highlighted the horrors that enslaved people endured, the psychological toll of being forced into a world that denied them agency, and how faith could be both a refuge and a weapon. Over time, folklorists documented tales in which Celeste appeared as both a ghostly figure and a moral lesson. Her story retold as a warning of the extreme consequences when oppression and devotion collide. In these stories, she is alternately a savior, a monster, and a mirror reflecting the cruelty of the society that shaped her. Tourists visiting New Orleans today may walk past the districts where her legend took root without realizing the depth of its origins. Graveyards along the old riverbanks, long-abandoned chapels, and the swamplands beyond the city are peppered with tales of apparitions and sudden chills in the air. Those who claim to have encountered her spirit report feelings of sorrow, intense unease, and sometimes a sense of inexplicable calm, as if the children she buried were nearby, whispering, and she herself was guarding them. Some say she still moves through the city during Holy Week, dressed in white, her voice carrying that same haunting lullaby, her mission unfinished. Her story also influenced art, literature, and music in New Orleans. Plays and poems were written inspired by her life, sometimes framing her as a tragic figure caught between a cruel world and her own extreme devotion. Jazz musicians and storytellers incorporated her myth into songs and tales, using her narrative as a lens to examine the duality of human nature, how love and obsession, piety and horror can exist in the same soul. Even local voodoo traditions reference her name indirectly, blending her memory with broader tales of spirits who straddle the line between life and death. Celeste's legend remains a chilling reminder of the human cost of systemic oppression. The children she buried were real, their lives stolen, yet their spirits, at least according to legend, live on tethered to hers. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, faith, and survival, how trauma can twist devotion into something unrecognizable, and how acts committed with belief in righteousness can be perceived as evil. Today, her legacy is intertwined with the haunted reputation of New Orleans itself, a city where the past is never truly buried and where stories of suffering, resilience, and the supernatural converge. The tale of the slave woman who buried children alive during Holy Week endures not only as a horror story, but also as a complex historical reflection, a reminder that the scars of injustice leave echoes that reverberate through generations. Even as centuries pass, the city remembers, whispers, and trembles at the memory of Celeste, her devotion, and the children who remain forever in her shadow.